You will hear about the African Union. Yes, it exists. But what is the effect of the African Union in reality? We cannot talk about integration in the theme and not talk about the African Union. Because it is this organization that should unite us, create real integration. But we regret to see these wars that persist on the African continent, killing millions of young people.
When Traoré walked into the African Union, he found an organization that had been conducting meetings about Africa's future, while systematically excluding the voices that actually represented African Union had been making deals, setting policies, and crafting statements that served everyone except the African people they claimed to represent. The humiliation was not in what he said, it was in how effortlessly he exposed the gap between the AU stance and its actions. Every carefully crafted AU statement about sovereignty suddenly looked hollow. Every proclamation about African independence rang false. Traoré came armed with something the AU had not encountered in years. Uncomfortable truths delivered without diplomatic sugarcoating.
You will hear about the African Union. Yes, it exists. But what is the effect of the African Union in reality? We cannot talk about integration in the theme and not talk about the African Union. Because it is this organization that should unite us, create real integration. But we regret to see these wars that persist on the African continent, killing millions of young people. And that this organization, which has heads of state, with armies, is unable to organize itself to support certain countries. The Union is not just a word. The Union is a symbol. And we, the youth, should learn a lesson from this situation to unite, to make integration a reality.
He refused to engage with the ceremonial aspects of AU meetings and instead demanded accountability for decades of organizational failure. The delegates who had grown comfortable with their roles as Africa's diplomatic representatives suddenly found themselves confronted by someone who actually represented African interests. The contrast was clear, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Most political confrontations at this level are choreographed affairs. Leaders know their roles, stick to their scripts, and maintain the illusion that meaningful dialogue is taking place. Everyone leaves feeling important, nothing substantial changes, and the cycle continues. Traoré destroyed this comfortable fiction in ways that left the AU leadership scrambling for responses they did not have. He refused to engage with the dramatic aspects of diplomacy and instead focused on outcomes. While AU representatives were discussing frameworks and protocols, Traoré was presenting evidence of their ineffectiveness. While they spoke about gradual reform, he demonstrated what immediate action looks like. The genius of his approach was in its simplicity. He did not need complex arguments or elaborate presentations. He simply held up a mirror and forced the AU to see what they had become, a collection of well-dressed officials managing Africa's decline rather than reversing it. But the real disaster came from his systematic dismantling of every excuse the AU had developed over the years. They had grown comfortable explaining why African problems were too complex for African solutions, why sovereignty had to be gradual, why independence required external permission. Traoré destroyed these narratives not through argument but through example. Burkina Faso had already solved problems the AU claimed were unsolvable. They had already achieved independence the AU said was impossible. They had already demonstrated effectiveness the AU insisted was unrealistic. The silence that followed his actions was not born of respect or contemplation. It was the silence of an organization realizing it had been caught red-handed, and that all their carefully constructed justifications had just been dismantled in real time. Traoré's most crippling weapon was not aggression or theatrics, it was his willingness to ask the questions that everyone else had agreed to avoid. Why are we still debating sovereignty while foreign military bases operate freely across our continent? How can we claim to represent African interests while African resources continue flowing out? At prices we don't set? Why do we need external permission to manage our own security challenges? These were not rhetorical questions. They were direct challenges to the AU fundamental legitimacy, asked in a forum where such questions are typically considered inappropriate. The beauty of this approach was in its unavoidability. The questions were so basic, so obvious, that any attempt to deflect them would only highlight the ridiculousness of the AU position. They could not dismiss him as uninformed. His track record spoke for itself. They could not question his commitment to Africa. His actions had already demonstrated it. They were trapped by their own contradictions, exposed by someone who had simply refused to pretend those contradictions did not exist. Each question cut deeper because it highlighted not just failures, but choices. The organization had not failed because African problems were too difficult. They had failed because they had chosen to prioritize external relationships over African results. The catastrophic nature of these questions lay in their simplicity. A child could have asked them. The fact that leadership had no satisfactory answers revealed everything about their priorities and competence. What made Traoré's words hit so hard was that he was not just talking from the sidelines. He had already put into action the very changes the African Union only discussed. While members were debating the theoretical possibilities of reducing foreign dependence, Burkina Faso under Traoré had already done it. While they discussed the challenges of resource independence, his government had already reclaimed control of their mining operations. While they preached about security cooperation, he had already kicked out foreign military bases. But the humiliation went deeper than just policy comparisons. Traoré had achieved these results with fewer resources, less international support, and more external pressure than most member states faced. If anything, Burkina Faso should have been the least likely candidate for successful independence. So it was not a case of someone criticizing from the sidelines. It was a case of someone who had actually solved the problems the AU claimed were unsolvable, explaining why their excuses were invalid. The specific achievements were impossible to dismiss. Burkina Faso's agricultural production had increased. Their mining revenues were staying in the country. Their security situation had stabilized after removing foreign military presence. Their debt burden was decreasing while their infrastructure investment was increasing. Each of these successes represented a direct contradiction of AU conventional wisdom. The organization had spent years explaining why such outcomes were impossible, only to be confronted by a member state that had already achieved them. The humiliation came from the realization that everything the AU said was impossible had already been accomplished by one of their supposedly small member states. If Burkina Faso could do it, what was preventing everyone else? The answer, of course, was that the AU had become invested in managing the status quo rather than changing it. They had comfortable relationships with external powers, predictable roles in international forums, and steady flows of aid and investment that depended on maintaining certain arrangements. Traoré's success had made their comfortable compromises look like what they actually were, choices made out of convenience rather than necessity. Numbers don't lie, and Traoré came prepared with numbers that made the OEU economic arguments look absolutely ridiculous. While AU summits produce eloquent statements about economic integration and intra-African trade, the reality is that most African countries still trade more with their former colonizers than with each other. While they discuss monetary sovereignty, most African currencies remain pegged to foreign powers. While they talk about industrialization, most African economies remain extractive operations for external benefit. The statistics told a harsh truth. After decades of AU existence, Africa's share of global manufacturing had actually decreased. The continent's technological dependence had increased. The gap between Africa's resource wealth and African living standards had widened. Burkina Faso's economic trajectory under Traoré had already begun showing what real economic independence looks like. Local production was increasing at rates that outpaced regional averages. Foreign debt was being managed more strategically, with new borrowing tied to productive capacity rather than consumption. Resource revenues were staying in the country rather than being siphoned off through complex financial arrangements. The mining sector transformation was particularly telling. Under previous arrangements, Burkina Faso had been exporting raw materials at prices set by external markets, with profits flowing to foreign companies and shareholders. Under Traoré's policies, the country had begun processing materials locally, capturing more value from their resources, and using mining revenues to fund domestic development. However, the O response revealed everything about their priorities. Instead of asking how they could replicate Burkina Faso's successes, they focused on why such approaches were unrealistic for other countries. Instead of studying what was working, they emphasized what might go wrong. This defensive reaction was perhaps the most humiliating aspect of the entire encounter. An organization supposedly dedicated to African advancement was actively discouraging the replication of African success. Their economic experts had built careers explaining why African economic independence was impossible, and suddenly they were confronted by someone who had achieved it. Rather than celebrating this breakthrough, they were trying to minimize its significance. The AU had grown comfortable with a definition of independence that was largely ceremonial. African countries could have flags and national anthems and UN votes, but real decision-making about economic policy, security arrangements, and resource allocation remained subject to external approval. Ceremonial sovereignty had become so normalized that O leadership genuinely seemed to believe they were defending African independence when they were actually managing African dependence. Traoré forced them to confront the difference between formal independence and actual independence. Burkina Faso was not only claiming independence, they were exercising it. They were not only talking about African solutions, they were implementing them. While other African countries were asking international partners for permission to restructure their economies, Burkina Faso was restructuring and informing partners of the changes. While others were requesting support for security operations, Burkina Faso was conducting operations and sharing results with interested parties. This created an impossible situation for the AU. They could not condemn Burkina Faso's approach without admitting that they preferred symbolic independence to real independence. They could not endorse it without acknowledging that their own approach had been inadequate. But the sovereignty challenge went beyond policy differences. Traoré had demonstrated that actual sovereignty was possible, practical, and profitable. This made every AU excuse for continued dependence look like an excuse that it is. The organization had built its entire identity around managing the transition to eventual sovereignty, and suddenly they were confronted by someone who had already completed that transition. Their role as intermediaries between Africa and the world was no longer necessary because direct African engagement was working better. Traoré's intervention carried additional weight because of what it represented generationally. The O leadership had grown comfortable with the assumption that political change in Africa would be gradual, managed, and ultimately compatible with existing international arrangements. The idea that young African leaders might reject these assumptions entirely had not been seriously considered. The generational divide was not only about age, but expectations. Older African leaders had come of age during the independence era, when achieving formal independence was the primary goal. They had spent their careers learning to work within systems designed by external powers. Traoré represented something the AU had not planned for, a generation of African leaders who had no investment in the compromises that previous generations had made. He had not spent decades building relationships within the existing system, so he had no reason to preserve it if it was not working. This generational difference was evident in every aspect of his challenge to the AU. Where older leaders saw the need for diplomatic patience, he saw the cost of continued delay. Where they saw the complexity of international relationships, he saw the simplicity of African priorities. The recognition that this generational shift was happening across Africa. Traoré was not an isolated example. He was the leading edge of a demographic wave that would soon dominate African politics. Young Africans had grown up with access to information that previous generations lacked. They could see what was happening in other regions of the world. They could compare African outcomes to global standards. They could measure O promises against O results. They know the AU approach is obsolete. Across Africa, other young leaders and political movements were watching to see how the AU would respond to a direct challenge to their legitimacy. Would they engage with the validity of Traoré's criticisms, or would they circle the wagons and try to isolate him? Their response would signal whether the AU was capable of reform or whether it had become an obstacle to African progress. It matters a lot because the AU reputation is already shaky among many Africans. Regular Africans had watched the organization make grand promises for decades while their daily lives remained unchanged or worsened. Mali and Niger has already begun implementing similar policies to Burkina Faso, and their results are being closely monitored across the continent. If these countries could achieve better outcomes through direct action than their neighbors were achieving through O frameworks, the implications for continental politics would be revolutionary. This is not just about Burkina Faso anymore. Other African countries are already beginning to ask similar questions about their relationships with external powers and international organizations. South African mining communities are questioning why their mineral wealth is not translating into local prosperity. Nigerian oil-producing regions are demanding more control over their resources. Congolese activists are challenging foreign involvement in their mining sector. Each of these movements drew inspiration from Burkina Faso's example and challenged AU explanations for why such approaches would not work elsewhere. Traoré has lit a fuse, and the O is discovering that they have no idea how to put it out. Traoré's challenge to the AU also has international implications. International partners had grown comfortable dealing with the AU because they knew the AU would ultimately accommodate external interests. The AU provided a front of African participation in decisions that were actually made elsewhere. This arrangement suited everyone except Africans. External powers got African endorsement for their policies. O leaders got international recognition and support. African communities got symbolic representation without substantive power. Traoré's intervention demonstrates that this comfortable arrangement is more fragile than anyone had realized. If African leaders start demanding real rather than ceremonial independence, the entire framework of external engagement with Africa will need to change. The AU have found themselves caught between their traditional external partners who expect them to manage this challenge and emerging African voices who expect them to support it. However, currently faced with specific criticisms, concrete examples, and direct challenges, the AU leadership has nothing substantive to offer. They can't defend their record because their record is indefensible. Each of their responses so far has made them look weaker and more out of touch. The encounter between Traoré and the African Union is not a moment of political theater, but a preview of the challenges facing African organizations in an era of changing expectations. Younger African leaders and populations are increasingly unwilling to accept that African problems require external solutions. They are demanding organizations that prioritize African interests over international relationships. The AU's eventual response to this challenge will determine whether they evolve into an effective advocate for African interests or whether they become increasingly irrelevant to Africa's actual development. Traoré's intervention made it clear that the choice is theirs, but the patience for gradual reform is running out. The African Union has been humiliated, but more importantly, they have been challenged to justify their continued existence in a rapidly changing African political landscape. Whether they rise to that challenge or continue managing Africa's decline will determine their legacy and Africa's future. Do you think the AU can recover from this level of organizational exposure? Can an organization that has spent decades perfecting excuses suddenly start delivering results? And more importantly, should other African countries follow Burkina Faso's example and abandon O frameworks entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this breakdown of diplomatic power dynamics made you curious, hit that like button and subscribe for more analysis of the political shifts reshaping Africa. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next video on the stories the mainstream media won't tell you. The age of managing expectations is over. The age of meeting them has begun.